We've talked about quite a few features that can form in deserts, but let's focus more on dunes because they can tell us a lot about the environment. Right? So sand dunes, I think of them kind of like Braille, right? They're textures on the surface that if you know how to read them, can tell you a lot about that location. You just have to understand how to read that texture. Right? So sand dunes reflect sediment availability and the dominant wind direction. How much sand is there and where the wind is blowing? So in order for dunes to form, they need a lot of loose sediment, usually sand. They need energy to move that sediment, usually wind. And they need an obstacle to trap that sediment, to cause the sediment to deposit out of the wind, often a little bit of vegetation. And as always, in a desert, you need a dry climate. Now, there are lots of different types of sand dunes that vary based on their shape, how they form, the direction of the wind. This table summarizes all of those very well, but we're going to march through them one by one. The first type of dunes we're going to talk about are the crescentic sand dunes. These dunes can either be Barchan or transverse. Barchan sand dunes, they're shaped like a crescent, and they're formed when there's strong wind in one direction, but only small amounts of sand and limited vegetation. So lots of wind, but only a little bit of material to work with. Transverse dunes are formed when there's weak wind in one direction, but there's a lot of material to work with, right? So lots of sand to push around. Okay. Barchan dunes, as I said, they look like crescents, okay? Whereas transverse dunes, they show up as very straight, linear dune ridges. The next type of dune we're going to talk about is the parabolic dune, right? And these are the dunes. They're also shaped like crescents, but rather than forming as just a little bit of sand with lots of wind, they form anytime that there's vegetation to anchor the arms of the crescent in place. So again, they're shaped like crescents. They're formed when there's vegetation around. Now you might be asking yourself, well, how in the world do I tell the difference between Barchan and parabolic dunes if they're both shaped like crescents? And the answer to that is, first, if there's vegetation around, if you see vegetation anchoring the arms of the crescent in place, you know that that's a parabolic dune. But even if you can't see vegetation, you can tell by the shape of the dune. Right? So we know that dunes often have one flatter side and one really steep side. That flatter side is the ramp that the wind blows up and over. And then that steep side is the back side of the dune where the sediment drops out or drops over the other side, cascades over the other side. Now, Barchan dunes, the arms of the crescent are going to be pointing towards the direction of the wind. The arms of the crescent are what are being blown with the wind. Whereas parabolic dunes are going to be the opposite. The arms of the crescent are what's being held in place by the vegetation. And so the center of the crescent is what's going to be blown by the wind. Right? So if you look at the cross-sectional shape, if you find the ramp side and then the steep side of the dune, that'll tell you which direction the wind is blowing. When you know what direction the wind is blowing, if the arms are blown by the wind, you know it's Barchan. If the arms are held in place by vegetation, they're not blown with the wind, you know that it's parabolic.